Thanks. Thank you very much, and thank you for Henry and Tim and the guys, Karina and so forth. I feel a lot more confident today. The last time I gave this presentation a couple of weeks ago, I gave it to some guys down at UCL, a bunch of professors and doctors and God knows what, and I found myself talking to them about certain scientific issues which I've come across lately, and I felt incredibly, as if they'd probably forgotten more than I'd ever learned about the subject. So hopefully there's not too many sort of professors in social science and whatever in the audience, and you know more about this than I do. Not that I'm professing for a moment. I guess what I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I should start by saying that I'm talking here today in a personal capacity and not necessarily as somebody from Prudential. I think that's quite important, but nevertheless, I'm abide to say that. Is a journey which started with two simple words, which were, I wonder. And the reason for that, I say that I guess it'd be about 18 months ago, I was fortunate enough to sit into a presentation given by somebody from the oil and gas industry. I think it was somebody like BP or Shell, who was talking about how they had a problem on their oil rigs off the west coast of Africa, where their guys were given the right training, the right kit, the right environment as such, and yet they were still making poor decisions, and it ultimately led to deaths. And they wanted to understand why. Now, I sat there thinking, well, that's with the exception of the deaths, I'm not aware that we've lost anybody through what I do at least. It's vaguely familiar. We're spending an awful lot of money on people and so forth, and yet they're still making poor decisions. And I started thinking, well, I wonder if we can make this work for cyber. And to cut a very long story short, we set about on that journey to understand if we can, and I think, cutting to the chase a little bit, we believe we can, and we can put a number on it and we can repeat it. And I'm just going to go through that journey and how we set about doing that. So the first thing we spoke internally a little bit is why bother? Why do we measure culture? And I should say, I've got no intention of reading all the words on the slides at all. My premise is that you probably can read far better than I can. And so I kind of leave it up to you guys to sort that. I'll just highlight certain parts. But we're certainly getting pressure a little bit about understanding culture from our regulators, particularly post-event. And it's always kind of hard to handle that sort of questioning when we've asked. We know, I certainly know, that people, our staff, are not immune to what I call momentary lapses of concentration. And for those of you who are getting towards my advancing years, you'll know that those momentary lapses of concentration seem to occur more frequently. So we're not immune from that, if we're honest with one another. And secondly, we felt that understanding the culture helps us, at least in some way, to reduce the risk and aligning security better to the business. So they were sort of three sort of reasons behind it. The next thing was, which I've been to an awful lot of these things over the years, is we talk a lot about culture, but what is it? We didn't spend spend a time understanding what it was, and we went looking out in various places, and we plumped upon the final one around risk culture, which comes from the North Carolina State University. So the reference, I think, is there, at the bottom, where we got it from. And it seemed, for us at least, to work what we were talking about for us, for us. Similarly, the other thing which we found confusing when we started on this journey, I heard a lot about, is people mixing up core values, culture, and behaviours. I remember talking to a guy who worked for a Japanese firm who spoke about, company, family, customer, all this sort of stuff first, and believing that was actually the culture of their organisation, when in effect it was what we consider to be core values. So we set about defining that. And for us, it's things, and I'm sure it's very similar for you guys. We talk a lot in our websites and stuff. Stakeholder value, honesty, innovation, those sorts of things that we consistently talk about within the business, which invariably don't change that much, for good reason. Why would you stop thinking about your customers, for example? It just doesn't make sense. So they rarely change. The culture part is the embodiment of those core values, and align to the needs of the business, and can in some ways those sorts of things change temporarily or longer term, and things we do due to commercial developments. We, like many other businesses, are going for a huge digital security program where everything's digitized. You know, we're doing apps constantly, you know, introduce them on a daily basis. You know, we can do premiums now by just taking a picture of your face, a selfie, and from that instantly work out a premium for a life product and so forth. So a huge amount of change in that. And then behaviours. These are sorts of things that make the culture doable, and in theory can be changed over time. We can change behaviours. And I guess we were in the area of measuring somewhere between the culture and the behaviour part of those two sorts of that sort of pyramid, and that's what we sought to understand a little better. This is where I got incredibly nervous with the guys at University College last week talking about the culture and the science. It's thankfully not based upon the work which we're talking about. It's not based upon some old fool like me, you know, just thinking about some idea that may or may not work. It's actually based on a guy called Philip Tetlock, who recently, you may recall, came to light, his work came to light talking about super predictors, and dear old Dominic Commins out of Number 10 was talking about him. And, well, Philip Tetlock did this sort of work and understanding how people, you know, behave. And he, excuse me, combined what they call knowledge constructs, and I'll talk a little about that later in a second, but also giving an idea of confidence around answers, around that knowledge. Now, confidence is a much better indicator of future action than it is something like a traditional Myers-Briggs, which is, you know, how likely are you to wear a pass, and so forth. Very unlikely, possibly likely, highly likely, and so forth. That's not a great indicator of future action. Confidence is. And this approach has been extensively tested elsewhere. As I say, it's been used in oil and gas. We've since become aware that it's been used in other sorts of accountancy, health, and various other sectors. So there was a good history of it, but it never, as far as we're aware, I'm aware, been tried and tested in cyber before. This is a strange slide. I've got to kind of put it in as a little bit of context. Over the years, I've developed a number of awareness packages, some of which were fortunate enough to win awards internationally, you know, in the States and Asia and over here, particularly when I was at Barclays and so forth. But it became clear to me that there were three fundamental problems with any awareness campaign we need to address. Firstly, it's often irrelevant to the user. What we tell them is, you know, we're telling them about stuff, you know, about using the Morse key, when in fact, you know, we've gone well beyond that sort of stuff, but we still insist on teaching them about how to use a bloody Morse key. I say that as somebody who used to know Morse when I was in the Army and Royal Navy before that, so I do understand that. So that's probably why I chose that sort of image. The second one is, if we're honest, the training is often boring. You know, we knock out a CBT for 20 minutes, you know, and we have a test at the end of it, and we expect everybody to be jolly grateful for having spent that time with it and I'll be thoroughly entertained. The third thing, it also, as a consequence, takes a big chunk out of the money out of the business. Not in terms of how much the CBT or anything, or the LMS at the back of it costs, but moreover that you're asking people typically, you know, on cyber alone, take 30 minutes, you know, times 30,000 people globally. You know, that's a big number. And then in our case, you know, I think I worked out the other day, I think I'll have to do something like 12 or 13 individual modules a year. So it mounts up. And of course, if it's boring and irrelevant, is it any wonder they don't work? I just put that in because it becomes relevant a little bit later. You may or may not agree with that premise, but that's kind of the sort of my experience of them in the past. So, the survey. It was an online survey. We initially did it for people involved in security and IT specifically, and we also did it across the globe, so we could pick up differences that way. We could also, although we couldn't individually identify individuals from the answers we got, we could identify their region, their occupational group, as it were, and their seniority. We developed a number of scenarios, knowledge constructs, which often took people out of their comfort zones and deliberately got them to challenge their thinking. So, for example, there's a sort of Pavlovian dog type response that if you say to a security professional, China, they immediately break out to a sweat and then think bad. That's their immediate reaction and don't think things through and just do stuff immediately and so forth. We deliberately did that. And then off the back of that scenario, we asked them a bunch of questions, typically which required a true or false thing. Now, the interesting thing about that was for us, two things. We spent an awful lot of time developing those questions. There were like 4 or 5 of us in a room, sometimes arguing the toss over who was right and so forth, but ultimately the final word came back to myself and a colleague to decide that. But the point was we were often taking people into what we recognise as least bad answers. There was not necessarily a perfect answer to what they were saying, which in itself was challenging to people because after the survey was run, I was getting phone calls from people saying, I've been in security for 20 odd years and I've got a CISP and I've got this, and the answer on that is, just couldn't get out of that sort of thinking. So we did that. And then having give their answer, they then asked to provide a confidence score about their answer. So based upon your answer, how confident I was, ranging from 0 to 100. And I'll come a little bit back to that in a second. Excuse me. We chose 5 areas that we wanted to measure and understand, and competencies sitting beneath those. Business focus, cyber risk, policy and best practice, cyber advocacy, and personal practice. Now, theoretically, you could choose whatever you want, but that's what we did, and as I say, developed a bunch of questions off the back of that. So now this is where it gets a bit interesting, results, so bear with me a second. There will be a chart that comes up in a second. Now, one of the things in the answers, what we wanted to kind of avoid, or at least highlight, is people who get the wrong answer but are 100% confident they're right. Right? Conversely, we wanted to avoid a situation where people are getting the right answer but have got 0% confidence that they're right. Because in either way, people are going to, at those two ends of the spectrum, they're going to make, if accept Tetlock's work about confidence being an indicator of future actions, either end of those spectrum, you're going to get people making poor decisions. We want to be able to empower our people to make the right decisions. And if they've got the right answer, but don't feel empowered to make that decision, then we're in trouble just as much as we've got somebody who's making the wrong answer, but 100% confident. And we had an algorithm stuck at the back of that, which kind of worked all that out. So stand by for a bit of, and I'll spend if I may, I'll spend a few moments just describing what you've got in front of you. So each column on that heat map, and this is just a section, this is just a subset of the sort of results we got back. Each column, it represents a person, right? Each row represents a question, okay? Now, the very top row is their average score across the entire test, which ranges from memory from about -6 to I think about +5. Now, within that scoring range and the colours, so at -6 is the darkest reds or the brightest reds through to greens at the other end. We can set a risk appetite and where we want to be and so forth. If I had time and could come and see us offline or whatever, I could explain a little bit more about that. But we can set a risk appetite where we want to be and where the training opportunity is, because it's not always necessarily at the two extremists as what we're talking about, where we can set that. So we can immediately set a risk appetite around that. The greens, so if somebody, and the other thing to bear in mind is, if somebody sort of sits on the fence, as it were, and continually gives a sort of 50-50, 60-30, sits around the middle about their confidence level, they come out as a sort of, I guess you'd call skin type colours in the middle. So we can kind of illustrate that. And those individuals, you'll see there's 1 or 2 individuals, if you run down the column, who did precisely that. They just said the answer, then kind of gave a mid-in sort of answer. So we can kind of identify those immediately. The other thing about that is that then we can start to look at individual subjects. Now, the bigger areas of green that you'll see are those areas where we've got people who are in things like policy advocacy, and so forth. The areas of red, where it gets to things like risk-taking, so, and understanding risk, and business alignment. Now, what is it as a professional? I've always been taught, to be in cyber is we need to be aligned to the needs of the business. Yeah, how many times have we heard that? All of a sudden, we've got evidence that supports that actually we're not terribly good at that. And actually, we've got risk, not terribly good at managing risk. So we can sort of prove that and so forth. Secondly, it shows us that where do we spend most of our money in terms of training and awareness going out? We tell them an awful lot about policy and so forth. And that's where we, our training and awareness sort of things, they've got to do this in policy, it says you've got to do that with a phishing email and so forth. Seems to me to make little sense that we're spending all that money, if you agree with my premise around it being irrelevant, boring and expensive, that we're spending all that money on areas which people already know and can be scientifically proved to know that going forward. So again, we've kind of proved that. Just to give you some overall scores, we've done pretty well. I haven't got too much time actually to talk too much about the times, but we've done pretty well with score. We can't really benchmark ourselves just yet terribly well because nobody else has done that. We're trying to encourage people to kind of take up this and so forth so we can start to benchmark ourselves against others and others can sort of benchmark in this sort of areas. Our confidence level, I spoke about empowerment, not unsurprising perhaps for financial service, we're a fairly cocky bunch. We are. I mean, I used to work at Barcap and whatever, and I would have thought that would probably have gone up by at least another 20%, if not more. So it's not unsurprising on that. So, conclusions. As I said before, we do a one-size-fits-all training sort of thing. I'm not sure it works terribly well. We are able to, from what we've seen as well, identify particular individuals and groups of individuals, some with seniority, who are getting getting questions wrong with 100% confidence. What does that mean? Particularly when you go into cultures where challenging your boss is not a good idea, and so forth. We need to address that as an issue. We're not terribly sure how we're going to do that, quite frankly. We can, as a consequence as well, start to make targeted interventions. We do use Tessian, and therefore we can use, start to use that with it. So we can start to bring stuff together. There's a whole bunch of other things I could talk about that we've done with this work and where we're going to go with it. And importantly, we can measure it again. We can go back, use the same sorts of things and see what's changed as a consequence to us running certain programs and interventions. I was taught many moons ago when I was in the army, be brief, be good, be gone. I'm not terribly sure that I've been very good. I've tried to be very brief, but I think it's almost time for me to be gone. So thank you very much.
Not yet, not yet.
Okay.
If the amount of questions that we've had streaming in from both online and in the audience is anything to go by, I think, yeah, very much you've been good, Mark. You've been good. So first question I'm going to take is, do you think that buy-in from one department is more important than another department, depending on the function? For example, let's say, is a client-facing role a lot more important that they have buy-in to your security culture than, let's say, a HR team who are entirely fixed?
No, not at all. I mean, one of the things, we deliberately at this stage chose to, IT and IT security, deliberately at this stage. It has been asked that, can we roll it out more broadly? Yes, is a short answer to that. Could be. We'd have to change the questions probably, but the methodology would work elsewhere, so we could do that. The only buy-in I would say, slightly tangentially to that question, is you need to make sure that people like HR and other departments are online, because it can be seen as some sort of like skills type audit and so forth, and people can get slightly anxious about doing it. And the other thing to make clear that we did, even to our people, this is not a test.
Yeah. There
are no right and wrong answers. Where we got extremes, so where it was all reds in an answer, where it was all greens, we went back, looked at the question. Was the question in any way ambiguous, worded poorly? I think in one occasion we changed one word to make it a bit better. Or did we get the answer wrong? Mm-hmm. He says somewhat modesty, forgive me. We didn't in that case. But we did go back and chase it. So that's how it...
And on that, and this is actually another question, so it segues nicely in, Did you see any themes in terms of the seniority of individuals that took the survey? Like, I guess from a confidence level, but also from a kind of like security score perspective.
Now you're taking me down a road that I'm not terribly,
Yeah,
not terribly keen.
Let's switch up the live stream for this.
Yeah, not terribly keen to. We certainly saw individuals whom were in key positions who weren't necessarily as attuned to certain things as one would hope. And that we need to run some sort of intervention for those individuals. Quite what that will look like, answers on a postcard, please, 1 Angel Court, is my address. Yeah, I mean, yes, is a short. We can identify from grade and location. As I said earlier, that can be challenging from a cultural perspective. You know, about challenging your boss is not always a great idea in certain cultures.
Yeah, and definitely a challenge that kind of we see across the industry from a security perspective. Okay, the next thing I wanted to come on to was, we've spoken a lot about identifying the key areas of risk and also like compliance within an organization. How important is it to not only act on the key risk areas that you identify and those themes that you identify, how important is it to do that, as well as reward the more positive behavior for where you've seen like really great security practices across the organisation?
Absolutely. You know, I don't subscribe to this thing about, you know, just highlighting the negatives and so forth. And, you know, every time we get a phishing email, it's that user's fault, you know, for doing that. Actually, I see it as our fault because in some way we've failed them because we've allowed that thing ultimately to get on the desktop. I mean, you know, in their email thing. So we've failed in that sense. So I take more responsibility myself rather than shift it, you know, onto users. God knows how many times you've heard it said, you know, users are your weakest link and all this sort of stuff, and they're stupid and all that sort of stuff. I completely disagree. So we do highlight the positives, but we also have to recognise, you know, where are we spending our money? If you go by my premise, you know, if you agree with that premise, where are we targeting our money? Are we targeting it in the right places so that people can make the right decisions? Because I ultimately see that our job, my job, is to give people the right information at the right time so they can make the right decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And a view that we definitely share over at Tessian with human layer security and the platform that we're building. This is a question which I don't necessarily think there's an answer to, but I think it raises some interesting points. How long does it take to build an effective security culture? We know it doesn't happen overnight, but how do you track towards ensuring that you are putting in place the milestones that it is an effective security culture?
Well, I don't, as you rightly, I'll use your answer. I don't know. Is a short answer because if you look at the work we've done where we can actually track it and put numbers on it and so forth, you know, as far as we understand, we're the first that have done that to any degree, and so we can't tell until we continually run it year after year and so forth to see what changes we're making. You know, it's well known that, you know, cultures don't happen in 5 minutes. They take years to build up and don't 5 minutes to just come up, ironically, we've got left. But they take years to
build a security culture.
Yeah, we take years to change, and it's a slow burn. I don't think there is I don't have a good answer. I'd have to refer to my colleagues back at UCL and elsewhere for better answers on that.
Have you found effective ways, I'm cheating here, this is my question. Have you found effective ways of playing back to users the positive changes that are being made in security culture to help perpetuate that route to like more of a more security awareness and like effectiveness from a user level? Again,
that's an interesting question. I mean, we certainly do, as I say, highlight the way we're changing, and highlight the fact that we are getting better in certain ways, and so forth. But, you know, we're always going to have momentary lapses of concentration. It's going to happen. And we need a combination of things. You know, your technology, which you use, you know, good process at the back of it, and understanding our people and giving them the right tools and, like I say, the right information. So I don't think there is any clever stuff in that. I just think we have to be more innovative. You know, we have to be more open-minded about stuff. This, as I say, started with, you know, like a fool like me just sitting there thinking, I wonder if we can make this work for us, and so forth, and taking ideas. And I'm not going to sit there, and say I've got all the answers to it. You know, I'm the panacea of knowledge. I'm not. I'm just not. And I'm sure that people have got some think ideas can say, well, that might be interesting, but if we could do this, then I'm sure we could improve it a bit more. So I don't think there's any clever stuff. I think it's all the good stuff, basic stuff that we kind of probably do to a lesser or greater extent.
I think it's I think it's also it's about continual reinforcement, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not saying like we can play a metric back to an organisation of employees and hope that they'll actually understand that and they think, great, we're doing a good job.
Yeah.
It's all these different mediums. People learn through different mediums, and we have to like exploit all of those to effectively do. Next question, which I think is a really interesting one. It's slightly different to what we were discussing earlier, but I think a similar angle as well, is with the research that you did and examining security culture, were there certain traits of individuals that, well, I'll go into this in a bit more detail, but were there certain traits of individuals that exhibited slightly higher security risks than others? An example being something that we think about at Tessian and our data science team live in is, a new employee, for example, is a new employee more susceptible to falling to a risk because they don't know your domains as well? Or conversely, is a new employee not as tuned into the fact that they can send a misdirected email? Did you see any clear patterns there that helped focus your efforts?
To be fair, we didn't capture how long an employee had been in the company for various reasons, not least because we didn't want to be. There's a bit of feedback, so I'm trying. We didn't want to be able to identify individuals. We wanted to make sure the thing was as anonymous as possible. I think that, however, there is a potential correlation between seniority and length of time in the industry and so forth, which would lead us to suggest that in some cases, not always, they tended to make poor decisions. Mm-hmm. So we have to be mindful of that. And of course, the other thing which we did was only measured at this instance a relatively small subset of the entire populace. So like I say, IT and security folk that we actually measured. Now, you could do it much wider. There's no reason why you couldn't, frankly, do it much wider and come up with exactly the same sorts of results or similar results. But the correlation between sort of time served and so forth is not a direct one because we chose, as I say, not to be able to identify individuals from what we were doing.
Sure. Leads me nicely onto my next question in terms of broadening the scope of the survey. Are you happy to share the methodology and tools, rationale behind this with other firms to allow them to measure their security culture?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to. It's not necessarily entirely our methodology. I mean, the question sets and so forth. More than happy, we develop those. The algorithm at the back, we work with somebody else on. But yes, I mean, we can certainly, if people want to reach out to me and have a chat, then that's cool. And I'm more than happy to. As long as you're not a professor in social science and so forth, I don't want that again.
I expect you're going to have a lot of people buying you coffees outside after, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause for Mark at Prudential.
Thank you.